So there are two further topics I'm going to endeavour to cover this afternoon, again, all under the umbrella heading of responses to risk. The first is the issue of viral inactivation, which I'll be dealing with fairly briefly, because we'll pick that up in March when we look at PFC and BPL in more detail. And the second is the issue of HIV screening of blood donations. I'm going to then in the morning deal with three matters. The first will be the question of the introduction of hepatitis C screening of blood donations and Dr Cash's involvement in and views in relation to that. That will be the last main topic in relation to Professor Cash. The second topic will be, in the morning, will be look back and his involvement in look back exercises, but that will be fairly short. And then finally, in relation to Professor Cash tomorrow, I'm going to look at some of the transcripts of his oral evidence to the Penrose inquiry. So before I do the two final topics for today, there's a short extract, or three separate extracts, in fact, from the 2017 Panorama documentary that we're going to play. They are three separate extracts, so they don't follow one after the other, although it will appear on the screen as if they do. And they show Professor Cash talking to camera. And I mention that in case that there is anybody watching on behalf of Professor Cash who would wish to know that his image will shortly appear on camera.
So what are we missing in the in-between?
A range of matters. So there are interviews with Dr David Owen or Lord Owen. There's interviews with Dr Brian Colvin. I think, I can't remember whether we've played the whole Panorama documentary in the hearing. I don't think we have. But there's a debate about self-sufficiency, I think, between the first and second excerpt, which will help you make sense of the second excerpt. I'm afraid I can't remember exactly what comes between the second and third excerpts. There are discussions about the Penrose inquiry, which then lead to, I think, the final excerpt. But they make sense on their own. So, Shomik, if we could play those, please.
In Scotland, they tried to avoid using American products altogether.
We took the view that the stuff's lethal. We took the view that this is sleepwalking to disaster, right from the word go.
But David Owen left the Department of Health in 1976, and self-sufficiency was never achieved.
The winner there is the pharmaceutical industry. The losers in that situation are the patients. For the patients to win, they want stuff coming from a safe source. And that didn't materialize as was needed south of the border.
But after the Penrose report, one thing became clear. In England, where the government relied on American factor VIII, haemophiliacs were twice as likely to be infected with HIV as those in Scotland, which made almost all its own supplies.
If you look at the difference between England and Scotland in terms of the outcomes, you have to conclude that it was not unavoidable. It was avoidable.
So those are the three short extracts from the documentary which feature Professor Cash and his observations. So if I then pick up the issue of viral inactivation within Scotland, as I say, we will be exploring this in far greater detail in March and hopefully hearing from Dr. Peter Foster. If we can look first of all at PRSC 303349. This was a statement that Dr. Foster gave to the Penrose inquiry. I just want to look at one very short passage at page 10. This was about the work on pasteurisation of factor VIII being undertaken in Germany. And if we look at the bottom half of the page, you'll see that in paragraph, sorry, just go up a tiny bit. Paragraph 5a, Dr Foster refers to a symposium in Bonn attended by Dr Cash, which Dr Foster's understanding was that was the first public disclosure of the work of Behring on the pasteurisation of factor VIII. Next paragraph, second sentence, he says that Dr Cash and other attendees of the symposium in Bonn in October 1980 would have been first to learn of this development. And then C, he recalls being informed directly by Dr Cash that Behring had claimed to be able to pasteurise factor VIII. This, he says, was the first time I had heard of this claim and was before I saw his letter of the 27th of October 1980 to Mr Watt. I'm not aware that anyone at the PFC knew of this work by Behring prior to the information from Dr Cash. And then if we just look at Dr Cash's letter of the 27th of October, which Dr Foster refers to, that's PRSC 403704, please. You've not got that? It's entirely possible that I have written down the reference incorrectly. I'll correct that in the morning.
Well, you've got an extra number in there. Try 3 zeros.
Oh, did I say 4 zeros? Yes, I'm sorry. 3704. Thank you, sir. So we'll see this is the reference, the letter that was being referred to. It's from Professor Cash to John Watt at the PFC, 27th of October 1980. And it says, "Dear John, during the meeting in Bonn, I learnt for the first time that Behringwerk are getting rather excited following chimpanzee studies that their preparations of factor VIII appear to be safe. The reason given is that they are heat treating the product for 10 hours at 60 degrees centigrade in the presence of glycine and sucrose. Apparently the glycine and sucrose protect the VIII from denaturation. Sounds unbelievable, thought you might be interested." So that's an early contribution by Professor Cash to the information available to PFC. If we then pick matters up in 1983, Professor Cash, by now, of course, fully aware of the work that was being undertaken by PFC to develop its own heat-treated product, wrote in January 1983 to Dr Forbes at the Glasgow Haemophilia Centre. I'm not going to go to the document, but I will just give the reference for the transcript. PRSC 304875. And he was inviting Dr Forbes to collaborate with PFC and undertake studies in relation to that concentrate. He then wrote to Dr Ludlam in June of 83, and again, I don't propose to go to this. The reference is PRSC 304875, I think. I'll check that overnight. And that was providing information to Dr Ludlam about the PFC's work on producing a heat-treated product and inviting participation in studies in relation to that. And there's further correspondence on that issue, which we've set out in the written presentation. There were a number of issues canvassed with Professor Cash in relation to the PFC's heat-treated product in his testimony to the Penrose inquiry. Again, I'm not going to go to it now. The reference for the transcript is PRSE 302836. That's one of Professor Cash's multiple statements to the Penrose inquiry in which he deals with the suggestion that the infection of the Edinburgh cohort could have been prevented if PFC had started its heat-treated work earlier. He says that he regarded that as a non-starter because it wouldn't have been possible to produce that in time to prevent the infection. He was also asked, for the purposes of his statements to the Penrose inquiry, about PFC's intermediate factor VIII product and the fact that it wasn't made available then until 1987, in contrast with the position in relation to the product produced by BPL. Again, I'm not going to go to that because we will pick it up more directly in March. And the reference for his statement, again, for the transcript is PRSE 40651. And he sets out his understanding there of a number of the technical challenges involved in developing the product. So that brings me to the final topic for this afternoon, which is the issue of the introduction of testing or screening for HIV of blood donations. Again, this was the subject of a statement to the Penrose inquiry, and this one I do want to put up on the screen. It's PRSE 0003395. And if we go to the second page, we'll see the heading Donation Screening Test Kit Evaluations. And he sets out a number of matters here which I think merit consideration in some detail. In February 1984, the SNBTS directors advised SHHD that there was an urgent need for the UK Department of Health to work together to ensure that appropriate steps were taken to expedite effective responses that would ensure as much as possible the safety of blood products in the face of the new threat of HIV/AIDS. Sometime later in early 1984, I found myself visiting Professor Robin Weiss's laboratory at the Chester Beatty Institute, London. The purpose of this visit was to explore whether Weiss's team could supply the SNBTS with adequate of HIV to enable PFC to undertake in vitro virus inactivation validation studies. However, I also noted that the Weiss team had developed a RIA to anti-HIV. At that time, I was only aware of the developing commercial ELISA programs in the US. So he continues, it seemed to me that the Chester Beatty Institute's HIV cultures and assay were important potential developments. I called Dr. Gunson to brief him and discuss how best the UK BTS might respond. I discovered that Dr. Gunson was already aware of the Weiss team's assay and was strongly in favour of it being commercially developed as an RIA and marketed by BPL. In the face of the advanced position of the more attractive ELISA technology in this field, I did not share his enthusiasm for a RIA approach nor BPL's involvement. Nonetheless, we agreed that Dr. Gunson would forward a proposal to DHSS that the UK Blood Transfusion Service should establish an assessment of the Chester Beatty Institute assay, alongside those ELISA assays being commercially developed. I was to discover that after consultation with others, Dr. Gunson wrote to DHSS in July 1984, advising that a NBTS, not UK BTS, technical team, so inferentially excluding SNBTS, should assess the Chester Beatty assay as soon as possible. I was disappointed that Dr. Gunson did not mention including an assessment of available US ELISA assays in the proposed evaluation programme, excluded any SNBTS involvement, and did not copy his letter to me. Dr. McClelland kindly sent me a copy of Dr. Gunson's July letter to DHSS, and throughout the late summer/autumn of 1984, I made repeated efforts to ascertain whether he'd received a response from DHSS. It soon became apparent there were difficulties. It appeared that both his passion for a RIA technical option and that the kits be manufactured in BPL had been challenged. Indeed, I had the impression that much precious time had been wasted in 1984 with internal civil service wrangles on this topic, rather than pressing ahead with assessing available commercial HIV donation screening kits, which were already under scrutiny by the FDA. As I recall, by December 1984, we knew Dr. Gunson had lost the battle. The Chester Beatty assay project had been handed by ministers to Wellcome Diagnostics Limited, and they, Wellcome, had, I believed wisely, rejected RIA in favour of ELISA. By late December 1984, there was deep concern among the SNBTS directors. Almost 12 months had gone by since they had advised SHHD to promote urgent interdepartmental action directed to ensuring the safety, with regard to HIV, of the UK blood supply. Moreover, we had evidence that the FDA was now well advanced in its assessment of HIV donation screening kits, which was later published. As far as we could judge, there was no evidence that our pleas for interdepartmental collaboration was occurring. We were also concerned that the official selected by SHHD to liaise with DHSS in this area was a medical officer with no knowledge of blood transfusion matters, no past or present operational contact with the SNBTS, and as far as we were aware, no line management links with Dr Burt Bell or Dr Archie McIntyre, SHHD. Finally, there was concern that the policy development priority in this area for the next 6 months might not be the assessment of existing commercial kits and expediting the introduction of UK-wide donation screening, but actions directed towards enabling Wellcome Diagnostics to catch up. The extent of the catch-up required as of the 1st of January 1985 seemed substantial. There was no doubt that in December 1984, a priority for the SNBTS was the evaluation of developed and developing commercial HIV donation screening kits. In this regard, we believe this evaluation should be done by UK BTS technical staff who had extensive experience of large-scale donation testing, and that the key information urgently required was specificity. We also believed, for the sake of our donors and our donor support staff, more technical effort was needed in the area of confirmatory testing. An analysis of the state of play, as seen by the SNBTS directors at January 1985, was conveyed to SHHD on the 24th of January. In the earlier weeks of January, the directors had met and decided to abandon the notion of a joint UK approach and instead mount an independent SNBTS evaluation of the commercial HIV donation screening kits as soon as possible. This decision was consolidated and conveyed to colleagues in SHHD on the 25th of January. I recall that we had made it clear to manufacturers that if they wished their kits and associated equipment to be evaluated by the SNBTS, then they would have to be supplied free of charge. As I recall this, they regularly agreed to. Thus, the only significant cost for this evaluation would be modest overtime payments for our technical staff. Once again, our primary first duty of care at this time was to acquire local data on the specificity of the screening kits, as the current information, some verbal, from the US on this issue had been confused, with reports of screen-positive rates in low-risk blood donor-like populations ranging from 1 to 10%. And then he continues, bottom of the page, some days after the 25th of January, I was invited to discuss the situation with Dr McIntyre, SHHD. Dr McIntyre made it clear that SHHD was strongly opposed to the prospect of SNBTS undertaking its own kit evaluation. He further advised that SHHD had given an assurance to DHSS that they were content with the proposition that HIV kit evaluations in the UK will be managed by DHSS, and that the commencement of routine HIV donation testing in Scotland would be determined by ministers on the advice of DHSS, and that this date would apply across the UK. I recall that Dr McIntyre also advised that these views would be transmitted to the CSA, Common Services Agency. As I recall, I thereafter consulted with Dr Mitchell and Dr McClelland, and we agreed that in view of the hostile reaction of SHHD, this SNBTS initiative should be stood down. This proposal was later conveyed to and supported by the SNBTS directors. This position may have given rise to my letter to the CMO Scotland on the 12th of February 1985. And then he sets out his understanding of what happened thereafter. Sometime after January 1985, it emerged that DHSS were moving to establish an HIV donation screening test kit evaluation programme. In the subsequent months, largely through access to EAGAR meetings, that's the Expert Advisory Group on AIDS, I came to the conclusion that this long-delayed DHSS-managed evaluation programme was less than satisfactory. My concerns can be summarised as follows. A, UK BTS scientific/technical experts, including the DHSS and SHHD consultant advisors in blood transfusion, were excluded from the design of the programme. B, the design was undertaken by DHSS virologists with no experience in or responsibility for large-scale donation testing. A further concern was that one of these virologists was heading the Wellcome Diagnostics HIV ELISA programme and that this was known to all planning team participants. C, the expert virologist with DHSS support insisted that there was to be an independent of UK BTS preliminary scoping study undertaken in PHLS laboratories and supervised by them, this phase 1 study had first to be completed before UK BTS teams could commence their evaluation. I believe that much of this preliminary study, which took nearly 6 months to complete, was unnecessary, and those elements of interest to the UK BTS could have been done as well and in much less time by a UK BTS team and more certainly by an SN BTS team as proposed in January 1985. D, because the DHSS invited virologists had no experience in large-scale donation screening, the design of this early scoping work was less than satisfactory in terms of UK BTS requirements, and some of the work had to be repeated, giving rise to further delays. E, it was of interest that the preliminary scoping study, phase 1, took almost 6 months, and the field evaluation, phase 2, done by UK BTS teams, 6 weeks. F, we were later to discover that this whole programme appeared to be dogged by lack of financial support from certain DHSS budget holders. It was also dogged by what seemed to be an extraordinary laissez-faire attitude among senior DHSS managers. One, the chairman at the May 1985 EAGA meeting, declared that the preliminary evaluation study, which began in March and involved only 220 blood donor sera, should not be rushed. Professor Arthur Bloom attended this meeting and rightly conveyed, both at the meeting and in a letter to the chairman, Dr E. Harris, his concern at the lack of urgency in clearing obstacles to the introduction of full routine HIV donation testing in the UK. Professor Bloom subsequently joined forces with the Haemophilia Centre directors of Glasgow and Oxford to put this view into the public domain. I'm not aware whether Professor Forbes discussed this with his SHS HCD's colleagues and conveyed these concerns to SHHD. Certainly, I have no recollection of him discussing his concerns with me. G, finally, there were no provisions in this DHSS-sponsored evaluation for studies on confirmation testing. To the best of my recollection, the orderly and leisurely progress of the 1985 HIV kit evaluations in the UK abruptly changed with the publication of concern at its slow rate of progress. As a consequence, appropriate UK BTS evaluations were not undertaken. Indeed, the only evidence I have that some form of RTC evaluation was done appears in a NBTS RTD's meeting minute of January 1986. It still is my view that HIV donation screening was introduced in the UK without the most appropriate consideration of the welfare of blood donors. And then finally, in this section of his statement, there were frequent occasions in late 1984 and the whole of 1985 when it was embarrassingly clear that DHSS had major problems in agreeing the funding of both the evaluation and implementation of HIV blood donation screening. It is not known whether SHHD were required to make a financial contribution to the PHLS Phase 1 study, but there seemed no doubt that SHHD had agreed in advance that ring-fenced funding for routine HIV donation screening in Scotland would be available when required. That said, SHHD used this position to ensure that it retained control of the start date. As far as I could judge, the main burden of the financial difficulties south of the border impacted most severely on confirmatory testing and the quality of the donor counselling programme. They commenced routine testing without an agreed strategy for confirmatory testing. So those are Professor Cash's recollections and reflections when he gave his written statement to the Penrose inquiry of his impression of the position in relation to HIV testing, which, as we know, was then introduced in the autumn of 1985. I'm not going to go through all of the rest of this statement. It does merit reading in full. And, of course, it may well be that much of what Professor Cash says would be disputed by others. But there are just 2 further pages that it's maybe useful to look at now. Page 16. So this is in response to a number of specific points that were then put to him for him to answer in writing. The first refers to a letter in the Lancet, which was co-authored by Dr. Cash. So you'll see the question is on the 21st of February 1985, Dr. Cash and others from the SNBTS and NBTS sent a letter to the Lancet. The letter stated, we the undersigned believe that the likely incidence of false positive HTLV3 antibody tests using the current generation of commercial kits in our voluntary blood donor populations will be high. And can we just look at that letter in the Lancet, and then we'll come back to the statement. It's at PRSE 304824. And it's on the second page. So there are letters by others, and you'll see the date there is referred to the 2nd of March 1985, which is not the same as the date given in the Penrose questions, but in any event, if we look at the right-hand column, the second letter down, you'll see there it's authored by a number of regional transfusion directors. So we have Dr. Alla, Dr. Contreras, Fraser Lee, Smith, Wagstaff, Collins, Entwistle, Harrison, Napier, Tovey, Brooks, McClelland, Mitchell, Abaniak, Whitcho, Perry, and then Professor Cash at the end. And some of these are witnesses who we'll be hearing from orally. And then if we just go up to the text of the letter, it said this: we believe that current commercial kits for HTLV3 antibody tests are likely to give a high rate of false positive results. We would therefore recommend that careful consideration be given before they are introduced for the screening of all voluntary blood donors, for the amount and degree of unnecessary stress and hardship that a fair number of our donors and their families would thus have to undergo is unacceptable. This, in turn, could lead to a sizable drop in the supply of blood and blood products. Of no less importance for the safety of transfused patients is the need to ensure that the first priority for the introduction of any HTLV3 antibody tests into a community is given to patients attending special venereal disease clinics and other members of the general public who wish to have access to these tests. If this is not done, many high-risk people from a blood transfusion point of view may present themselves at blood donation sessions simply to find out their HTLV3 antibody status. We do support strongly the screening of all blood donors for HTLV3 antibody testing, but we would advise that this is delayed until test systems have been appropriately evaluated and efforts have been made to give all members of the public access to HTLV3 antibody testing. Now, whether that is entirely consistent with everything that Professor Cash says in his statement may be a matter to which further consideration will need to be given. It's certainly not inconsistent with everything that Professor Cash says, because obviously he's critical of what had been happening in the evaluation process prior to the date of the publication of this letter. But nonetheless, here is a letter to which his name is appended, which is urging a degree of caution and further work to be undertaken before the testing is introduced. If we then go back to his statement, PRSC 0003395, page 16, thank you, Shomik, his comment is, after so many years, I'm reluctant to comment on behalf of my SNBTS colleagues, but there was no doubt in my mind, after consulting with several US colleagues, that the position in February 1985 with regard to the specificity of the available HIV donation screening kits seemed a little uncertain and somewhat confused. Whilst an early claim that some of the kits had a high screen positive rate, I was advised by US colleagues that there have been significant improvements, such that by late 1984, early 1985, figures of less than 10% screen positives were quoted. The US team reporting this figure, which was based on a study of over 1,000 donations, claimed it would be acceptable provided the donors who were screen positive but confirmatory test negative were reinstated and not excluded from future donating. As I recall, this false positive reinstatement approach was considered and rejected by UK BTS, as there was at that time lack of confidence with regard to the efficacy of confirmatory tests. It followed that we might be faced with a loss of up to 10% of our donor panel. On the other hand, I recall from contacts with FDA colleagues, I think in late 1984, that the kits they had recently looked at had screen positive rates of only 1% in a low-risk population, which would have much in common with our donors. And then, final point is the bottom of the page, reference is made in the question to the letter from Professor Bloom, and again, we've looked at that, I think, on more than one occasion, that one of the kits, at least, should be introduced immediately. And Professor Bloom, Dr Ritzer and Dr Forbes wrote to the BMJ to that effect. We see the top of the next page. Professor Cash's reflection on that is as follows. I must confess to being a little surprised that Professor Bloom's concerns, which I strongly supported, were later put into the public domain. That said, I recall believing that had not Professor Bloom and his colleagues gone public, then the UK HIV donation screening programme might have commenced even later than 14th of October 1985. So that's Professor Cash's comment on the intervention of Bloom, Ritzer and Forbes. There are, I think, 2 or 3 other documents, two other documents I just want to look at to complete this topic. And it's an exchange of correspondence in March of 1985. The first is NHBT 0007985. I'm not going to read the whole of this letter. If we go to the second page, it's a long letter from Professor Cash, dated the 14th of March 1985, to Dr Abrams in the DHSS, and it follows a meeting that had taken place on the 13th of March, and he sets out a number of concerns about what was and was not discussed at that meeting. You'll see at paragraph A, he looks at the evaluation exercise in relation to the screening kits and says it must include the Western blot technique. If we go to his paragraph C, he says, I was interested and pleased to note at the 13th of March meeting that the EGA, Expert Advisory Group on AIDS, agreed that HTLV3 antibody testing should be introduced simultaneously in the UK transfusion services, and then asks the question of how that would be implemented without additional central funding. So his view in this letter was, it would appear firmly in favour of a simultaneous across the UK introduction of testing. And then if we go to the next page, again, I'm not going to go through the detail. Paragraph G refers to the question of false positive donors and donations and how that will need to be addressed. H deals with issues relating to the question of counselling donors who were not false positive but found to be truly HTLV3 positive. If we go over the page, there are then discussions, for example, at K about what information should be, how information about donor testing and donor results should be handled. And then if we go to the last page, he just makes one last point. If it's been decided that the UK transfusion services will introduce HTLV3 antibody testing simultaneously, then we will soon need to have an approximate expected date for the completion of the kit evaluation and thus D-Day. This will in turn sharpen our thoughts with regard to the planning of when donor counselling systems will have to be up and ready to receive their first donors. The sooner this detailed planning commences, the better, for, based on the experience of Dr. Pinchin's group, there will be a requirement for training. He copied that letter or sent to Dr. Gunson, and the final document to consider is NHBT 307984. This is Dr. Gunson's response to Dr. Abrams, and you'll see in the first paragraph, Dr. Gunson characterised Professor Cash's letter as rather aggressive. and then he deals with each of the points in turn. I'm not going to take time now going through that, but it is no doubt a letter that you will wish to consider in more detail in due course. There was further discussion about the AIDS screening tests and the consideration of the various tests under evaluation at the 5th meeting of the Expert Advisory Group on AIDS in July of '85. That was attended by Professor Cash, but the minutes don't record his particular contributions to the discussion on that issue. So I'll just give the reference, which is PRSE 302628. As we know, HIV donation testing was then implemented across SNBTS and England, Wales and Northern Ireland in October 1985. There is one final letter from Professor Cash several years later, which touches on it. SBTS 5061_033. This is a letter from Professor Cash to the Central Legal Office, 1st of August 1990, and the context is the HIV haemophilia litigation. So it's commenting on a chronology document that I don't have as a comparison for the purposes of following every point he makes here. But he's clearly in the main paragraph talking about the development of the HIV donation screening. And he says this, in the second line, I'm bound to say that the SNBTS was excluded from the key discussions which took place on the 28th of June 1984. I emphasise key because they provide the first evidence of a development, HIV donation screening, which was not implemented until October 1985. He then refers to issues about funding and suggests that decision in November 1984 may have had a crucial bearing on the delays of the results of the initial evaluation of HIV tests and perhaps the subsequent field evaluations. You will recall that mass HIV-1 donation testing was commenced in the USA in March 1985 and not until October 1985 in the UK. So there appears to be implicitly at least a suggestion that there was unnecessary delay in the introduction of testing. But you will need to evaluate that as against what Dr. Cash himself was saying, amongst other things, in that letter to the Lancet in March.
Yes, and he was saying that delay was desirable.
Yes. So that completes this topic. I say completes. There's a huge amount more that will need to be examined in relation to that topic, but not through the perspective of Professor Cash. And so I propose then tomorrow to deal with the 3 topics I referred to earlier. The main focus will be on the issue about hepatitis C screening, but I'll also deal with questions of surrogate testing as well.
Thank you. Very well. 10 o'clock tomorrow.
Thank you, sir.